Hi there, welcome to video 2 of our kick analysis series where we're going through analyzing the creation of multiple different kicks in different genres. In this video we're going to go through how I made this deep house kick. First I'll play it so you can have a quick listen to what it sounds like. So it's a very simple, mellow deep house kick. There's quite a lot of low frequency energy over there and not too much of high frequency transient. So first I'm going to open up the synthesizer, Kick 2. Now Kick 2 is my synth of choice. It's the synth that I've used for the whole of our kick drum course, if this is where you're watching the video. I just think it's the most versatile synth for kick creation for many reasons. So first of all, what I'm doing here is using a sine wave for my oscillator. And then I'm pitching that sine wave with this modulation envelope from not a too high frequency, around 2 kilohertz, down to 247 hertz to produce my transient. Now, comparing this to the big room kick, the transient started at almost 20 kilohertz. So significant difference. It's because deep house is supposed to have quite mellow, kind of like muted kick drums. Then they don't come through too much. They're there, but they're there to support the groove of the track. So we don't want the frequency of the transient to begin too high. In this case, around 2 kilohertz. I recommend between 1 and 5 kilohertz, depending on how sharp and high pitched you want that transient to be. So I'll press play. I'm going to move this up and down so you can hear the difference. See, it's a bit too sharp for me there. And there, for me, I don't get quite enough of a transient. So I'm going to put it to around where it was before, close to 2 kilohertz. Then the low mid-range part, which generally produces the punch in the track, it's not sustaining there for too long. So you can see I'm hovering the mouse over here. That's roughly 100 hertz. That's only 21 milliseconds into the kick. If you're looking at the graph here, you'll see that within 21 milliseconds, we have reached 100 hertz or so about there, 20 to 23, 24 milliseconds. This means that we're not going to get too much energy in those low mid frequencies. So the kick isn't going to sound too punchy at all. Now I'm going to load up an EQ just to open up the analyzer. So you can see that there isn't too much energy there. There's a bit, but it's passing through it very quickly. If I was to sustain those frequencies longer, let's say by doing this, so now it wouldn't get down to 100 hertz until about 50, 60 milliseconds. You see we get much more of a punch. Before, after. So I'm going to keep it like that because it's deep house. I don't want the kick to be too punchy. Now, if you haven't seen the full kick synthesis course, I'll give you just a quick overview. The longer you sustain certain frequency regions, the more energy you'll get there. So between around 100 to 400 hertz is where you get that punchy part of the kick. So if you pass those frequencies quite quickly, you're not going to get too much of that punch. But if you get them to sustain there longer, you'll get more of that punch around those frequencies. So I'm getting them to pass through quickly, therefore having a fairly soft kick. Now looking at the amp envelope, I'm starting the kick immediately, so we're getting the full force of that transient. And then it's just decaying gradually. The overall kick lasts about 300 milliseconds. I could make it shorter if I wanted to. But again, that depends on your track. It depends on whether you've got a sustained sub bass or not, whether you've got actually a sub bass playing alongside your kick. If you do, maybe you want to reduce the length of your kick so they don't clash too much. Fully depends on your track. Then I also have a sample playing alongside this. This sample just generates kind of a mid-range transient. So it's very short. It gives me a few high frequencies, a bit more of a transient around here. Again, I don't have any samples that generate very high frequencies like you would find in my big room kick, which I went through in the previous video, which had a very sharp transient, because in big room we need a lot of high frequency content. So a kind of mid-range transient. If we look at the envelope here, you'll see that it's very, very short. So at 100 milliseconds, it's completely ducked out, but really the majority of the energy is in the first 30 to 50 milliseconds. Then let's look at the processing that it's going through. So I've got a compressor, the lovely CLA2A. This is an emulation of the iconic LA2A analog compressor. Now this compressor is quite slow. This means that it's going to let the transient through uncompressed. So you're going to get quite a lot of clickiness generated when you use this compressor, because it won't compress the whole kick. It will compress pretty much the second half of the kick. So I'll show you what that means. This part of the kick drum, the beginning, will be let through uncompressed, and then it will start compressing from a few milliseconds into the kick onwards. So because it's generating a sharper transient, I've compensated by adding a transient designer after and reducing the transient energy quite significantly. So I'm going to mute the effects and we'll listen to what they're doing one by one. Here's the kick with no effects. Here's the kick with the compressor. It warms it up quite nicely, but you can hear the transient is much more prominent. Without, with. Then I'm adding the transient master to compensate for that sharp transient. So it's reducing the volume of the transient. So here's without the transient master, and then with. That transient is reduced to being very soft. And I've also increased the sustain a little bit to bring back a bit more energy into that warmness, into those low mid frequencies that the compressor is helping us generate and Kick 2 is also generating. So that is the process for creating a lovely deep house kick. Remember, transients shouldn't be too sharp, so try to avoid really high frequency samples. And if you're using a kick synth, don't have the pitch starting at too high a frequency. Maximum 5K is what I would recommend. Try to avoid having too much energy between 100 and 300 hertz, and then have more energy in the low frequencies from 100 and below. Of course, you can add some compression, you can add some transient masters or designers. You can also add some EQ, but in this case, I didn't feel like I needed it, because what you would normally do with EQ is reduce the energy in the low mid frequencies. And you would do a little dip like this around 200 hertz. In this case, Kick 2 already has a preset EQ that's done a little bit of that for me, but also I've managed to reduce them further with my pitch envelope curve. Fantastic. Go ahead and try this yourself. Thank you very much for watching. Consider subscribing and give a thumbs up to the video if you feel like you've learned something, and I'll see you in the next video.